I've had a few people asking me how I edit my photos, in particular the astrophotography that I do. So I thought I'd just make a little video today, just walking you through how I edit something like this, and what steps I take, and just giving you a bit of a general idea how I go about doing an edit like this. I've never done a video like this before, so I'm just going to wing it, see how it goes. So let's get into it. Now, this photo was taken with my Sony A7S, just out in my back paddock, actually, with the new Sony FE28mm f2 lens, which I just got recently. I thought it'd make a good sort of astrophotography landscape lens, and it is, like, it's a good lens. I really like it, and for this sort of work. Now, this was shot at ISO 6400, f3.2, and it was a 15-second exposure. Just following that 500 rule, to avoid getting star trails, you divide 500 by your focal length. So that was 500 divided by 28, which worked out to be about 17. So I usually like to stay a bit under that, so I went with a 15-second exposure. Now, straight up we can see that this photo is quite warm. The color temperature is a little bit off, but that's the good thing about shooting raw and working with raw files, is that you can do that later in post. So that's my first bit of advice for anyone shooting astrophotography, would be to always shoot in raw, just because it retains all that detail captured, and doesn't do any in-camera processing. So straight away I'm gonna just bring down the color temperature of the photo until it looks a bit more sort of natural, and that looks pretty good to me, actually. Around 3600 looks about right. Straight away I can see that the landscape is a bit underexposed, and I think the whole photo is a bit underexposed. Generally I'd like to keep a bit more detail in that landscape. So I'm going to begin by adding a graduated filter down the bottom, just bringing that up to around the horizon line, like that, and just bringing up the exposure. All of the highlights are done, so bring up the highlights, and I might push it to about 2 stops, and I'll just bring up the shadows as well, maybe to about 45, and that looks pretty good for the time being. So I'll bump up the general exposure to around 75, and I'm going to bring down the shadows, because down in these bottom corners there's actually a bit of color noise, and that's that sort of purple hue you get down there. So if I just bring down the shadows a bit, actually reduces the color noise in those corners. And I don't know if you can tell, but down here there's actually a telegraph pole that's just bothering me a little bit. So I'm going to crop that out of the photo. Going to lock that to make sure I keep the ratio. Just cropping that pole out like that. And I'm going to add my second graduated filter, which I'm going to bring down from the top, just to bring out more detail in the Milky Way and in that galactic center of the Milky Way. So I'm going to boost the highlights a bit there, and I bump up the contrast just to make sure, oh, too much, maybe 75, just to give that nice, we begin to see the sort of nice detail around the galactic center there and in those dark dust lanes. And pushing the clarity a bit also helps just to bring out that detail. Saturation I'm going to increase as well, so we begin to see some orange in those dust lanes. Now I'm going to also just bring up the clarity of the overall shot. A lot of people say to avoid using too much clarity, and I agree. If you use too much clarity, what can happen is you get this sort of weird halo-y look around the high contrast areas, and you can really see that just around these leaves here. It looks a bit weird. So I like to keep the clarity quite low, maybe about 35. That looks pretty good. I'm going to bring up the highlights just a bit, and the whites I'm going to bring up, and actually I'm going to pull down the highlights, because as you can see, as I pull them down, I get more detail in this sort of cloud here. The blacks I'm going to raise just to bring out some more detail in the foreground. Vibrance I'm going to bring up a little bit, as we can sort of begin to see more color in the sky, and to me that looks too green. So I'm going to change the tint and bring it up a little bit, maybe to around 17 or so. That gives it a nice sort of purpley blue hue, which looks more sort of like the night sky. I'm going to bring up the contrast of the overall image just to bring out more detail in the galactic center up here, and just in those clouds around the dust lanes around here. Now the foreground I'm going to bring up the exposure just by using the left hand side of that tone curve, and try to avoid bringing it up too much. It's quite tough to. There, I think that looks quite good. You can still see a bit of that color noise down here, so I'm just going to add another point, bring it down a little bit, and then I'm going to turn it into a bit of an S-curve by lowering the left and bringing up the right. And that gives it a nice bit of sort of contrast to the overall image. And I think the clarity is looking a little bit too high, so I'm just going to bring that down to about 26. Going to raise the exposure as well, maybe to just over a stop. Now down in this left hand corner is a little solar shed with the solar panels on top there. So I'm going to add a little bit of a spotlight down there just to bring a bit of attention down there. So I'll just raise the exposure a little bit. Around just over a stop. Bring up the contrast. And the shadows I'm going to bring up as well. That looks pretty good. Now down the bottom here there's quite a bit of noise, and that's because I underexposed the image and had to push it up push up the exposure in post. So I'm just going to add a little bit of noise reduction. Should smoothen out the bottom here. So I'll bring that up to about 10. And after I'm finished, I just like to play with these sort of levels and just see what works best. the shadows, let's bring them down to about -20. The whites give a nice bit of contrast. You can really see the shape of the Milky Way and the galactic center up here. And the blacks I'm actually going to just bring down a tiny bit. So that's about all for the image. Now if we look at our history, if we go back to the start, we can see sort of where we started. And then where we finished. I think that looks pretty good. So that'll do it for today. Like I said, if you have any questions, feel free to ask me, and I'll try and help you as best I can. If you'd like to see more of my work, I'll put all my social media links in the description below, and you can check out more of my photos there. Thanks for watching. Bye.